Hi, welcome to the Writing Well. We have Amelia Golden today to tell us about her writing process. And I can vouch for her writing skills because I learned how to write from her. Welcome. So, tell us about your background.
My background. Well, I really don't know what to say, but I've been writing since I was a teenager. So I began writing poetry, and I started the junior high newspaper, and I co-edited the poetry journal in high school. And ever since, I've been writing poetry and nonfiction and essays and information for blogs and websites. So writing's always been part of what I do. It's not something that I make money off of, but it's something that I've always done. And I have for many years.
I'm going to interrupt you
Ah.
and say that I disagree with that statement of not having writing be something you make money off of because you spent many years as an English teacher.
Well, I was about to say that. So, yeah, I did teach English for quite a number of years to junior high and high school students. And I think my strength was teaching students how to write.
Yes. True story.
Which is something that's very labor intensive in a way and is often disregarded in modern public education because of time demands and testing and teaching to
That's
the teacher.
true. Being able to write a coherent, logical essay is not something valued in any sort of standardized test. Even the AP exams, where you're writing about history, they don't grade those essays based on whether or not you wrote an essay that's comprehensible. They grade them based on whether or not you remembered the right numbers and the right facts. And
well,
having a coherent introduction and a coherent conclusion is not relevant to your grade on any of those tests.
I learned that lesson in college when I was, for the first time in my life, got a B on some papers. And I'm like, what, a B? Me? I don't get B's on papers. And I kept writing the TA who was grading our papers, well, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? And it's because it was in sociology. And I was used to writing more literary papers. And in a literary paper, you try not to use the same word twice unless you have to.
Right.
Right? And so that was the style that I wrote in. Well, this guy in sociology wanted me to use the same word every time for the same thing so that I had clear terminology. I'm like, oh.
Well, he wanted you to be boring and you refused, and so your grades suffered.
Yeah, so he wanted me to dumb down my writing, and I finally figured out that's what he wanted. So I only figured this out right before the final exam, and I was really mad about the whole process. And so we, back in the day, we used these blue books to write our final exams in. So I did a one-sentence introduction, my thesis. Then I had my 3 paragraphs, and I had a 1-sentence conclusion. I got 100%. Okay. That's all these people wanted was to, know whatever. Anyway, that's not the way I like to write.
Yeah. So how has your writing process evolved over your life?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that much. I mean, I was about to say that, I started writing poetry and I've always continued to write poetry. So that's kind of a background kind of theme or layer that's always been there. And for me, poetry is a process of really condensing and crystallizing an emotional experience.
Right.
And to write poetry, I get in a kind of daydreamy state, a kind of reverie. And the sound of the words is really important to me, the musicality of the words.
Right.
So my poems tend to have a lot of, assonance and consonants and a certain amount of alliteration. And the images are important. But for me, even more important than the images is the sound picture that I'm creating.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the quality of the vowels. So, in poetry most generally, I've written out of my inner experience. I don't tend to write works of art, works of poetry about nature or things like that. I use images of nature in my poetry, but my poetry is expressing in my inner life.
Right.
So, and I have to give some credit where credit is due. When I was in high school, I took English classes, and we had to write essays quite a lot back in the day. And I learned how to write essays from my sister. From my
Which one?
Sister. Yeah.
Which one?
Catherine.
Really?
Yes, indeed. And she helped me write essays, and it was really great. I mean, she was really good at it. And I remember this essay I wrote in high school. It was for some English class, but I wrote the essay on Dukas. What's the piece of music called? The Pale, the the Sorcerer's Apprentice or something. There's like the Pale, and then things start happening. Oh gosh.
I have no idea what you're talking
Anyway, it's a piece of music. It's a short piece of music.
Okay, and you had to write an essay about this piece of music.
No, I had to write an essay in general, and I could choose what the topic was. So everybody else wrote about books or poetry or whatever, and I wrote this essay on a piece of music.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really cool. Anyway, so I got to use all kinds of words about, harmonies and dissonance and all kinds of things. Anyway, that left a memory for me as just kind of a unique writing experience where I fulfilled all of what you're supposed to do in an essay, and it was creative and different. And
right.
I have to actually go back even further, because in 6th grade, throughout elementary school, I was bored a lot, but especially in 6th grade. And we had an assignment to write for science. We had to take 3 of the systems, digestive system, nervous system, circulatory system, and write them up in some kind of report. And basically, they wanted us to regurgitate what we had learned, and I was so not going to do that. And so I wrote these stories about these systems. So I don't know if I even had mice or whatever. I don't know. My science report was in the form of a short story, and it gave all the information that was required in the form of a story. And all this harkens back to even younger in my childhood, when I would make up stories all the time. I mean, I was very much a daydreamer, and I guess I had trouble falling asleep at night, and I would make up stories every night.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking back then, if there was some such thing, like essentially what later became a keyboard, if there was a thing like a keyboard, I could be typing these stories at night, and I'd have all these books written by now. But they faded away. But also, when I was a teenager, I would entertain my family with stories that I would just kind of spin out of my head every night to them. Which was really fun.
Yeah.
My daughters have told me that they enjoyed the stories that I made up for them at night, which were also
true.
spun out of my head. So unfortunately, my son has lacked the patience to listen to a story spun out of the head without pictures to look at. So that hasn't happened there yet, but
Maybe it will.
maybe it will. Anyway, stories are part of how we make meaning out of life.
Yeah.
How we understand life. And I've always wanted to write a novel,
Mm-hmm.
and I've never managed to do it. And for me, it's a big writing block issue. Like maybe I'm just not supposed to write a novel. Because whenever I sit down to write, I write poetry. But I also write a lot for various organizations and other groups. And for me, if anything, I have to worry about being too wordy.
Yeah.
As opposed to not getting enough out there. So, in my opinion, the quality of one's writing really reflects the quality of one's thinking,
Mm-hmm.
especially for nonfiction writing. So, people who have difficulty writing nonfiction often have difficulty organizing their thoughts. So if it's a longer piece for nonfiction, I will usually jot down notes almost like an outline in the document itself,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of divvy it up into paragraphs so that I
Mm-hmm.
have a sense of the chunks of what I'm
Yeah.
going to write. And almost always I leave my introduction and conclusion to the very end.
Yeah, well, how else are you supposed to know what you're introducing and what you're concluding if you haven't put the middle?
Figured out the middle yet?
Yeah.
There are those people that know what they're going to write, and there are those people that don't know what they're going to write till they actually write it.
Yeah. Well, and from my experience, I think you can get to the second stage by doing the first version. No, I'm saying it backwards. If you want to know what you're going to write before you write it, you have to practice figuring out what you're writing by writing it for long enough. And long enough is one of those things that's different for every person, so there's no like rule about how long enough really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, usually my go-to mechanism if I get stuck in writing is to do a free write.
Yeah, that works really well.
But I'm also pretty careful about my writing. So once I've written something, I want to craft it and clean it up and make it good. So I usually obsess about it for a couple days before I will post it or, publish it in any way like that. But then once I've done that, then I'm usually done with it.
Yeah.
So, I write something. It's a very personal, creative process.
Right.
And in a way you're putting yourself out there as this is something I've written. This is something about who I am. And I want it to be, to be good. So I do have this tendency to obsess about what I've written for the next 2 days after I write it. And, during that time, I'll probably reread it several times and make a few changes. And then after that, I'm done with it. And then, it's pretty rare that I go back and change things later.
Yeah.
It's happened a couple of times with a few things, but, and then nowadays with all this online publishing and blogs and whatever, once it's out there, it's out there.
Right. So once it's out there, but it's also much easier to go back and revise it. Like if you were publishing the article in a magazine or a journal or a newspaper, you wouldn't really have a chance to go back and change it 3 weeks later if you realize there was a typo. But if you do on your blog, you could just go fix it if you really wanted to.
Well, Ariana, in anything I publish, there would be no typo. Come now, really.
That's true. You're an excellent editor. So So how is it different to write and structure and think about something that's nonfiction versus to write and structure and think about something that is poetry or a short story?
Well, and there's that middle piece of creative nonfiction,
Right, right.
which uses.
So I would I would put creative nonfiction in the context of this question in the short story category, right? Because I think it's more similar. The process is more similar, isn't it?
Yeah. Um, when you're writing nonfiction, there's usually a clear purpose for your writing. I mean, it conveys some kind of information, or you have a particular audience that's wanting to hear something, or there's kind of a limited topic in general is usually there from the get-go. Of course, this isn't true in college English classes, but in real life, there's usually a purpose for writing that is in itself already pretty clear, or else you've worked it out. If you're doing a blog, for example, you think about things you might want to write about, and then at some point you choose a topic. And so the process is different for what type of material. And there are a few situations where the kind of standard essay format that you learn in college works or serves you well. Nowadays, most people want shorter pieces and less intro conclusion around it, just more like get to the point, say what you want to say, and be done. So I guess I'm drifting here. I'm not quite sure how to answer your question. I mean, with the poetry and creative, it's a very different process. Where, like I said, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Where, I get in a more kind of daydreamy state and more kind of pensive and more in a reverie, and I'm thinking and imagining and trying to create details. I mean, so I guess for me, the practice of doing poetry is really informed my creative writing, because even in short story, I'm always searching for those details of setting of the natural environment that will shape the mood that I'm trying to create.
Right.
And I'm able to do that because of all the work I've put in poetry. I struggle more with things like dialogue in creative writing, where I have less experience doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, in nonfiction writing, things usually flow. I spend a lot of time gathering information, doing research, background stuff, and I kind of let that stew for a while, for a couple of days, and then usually when I'm ready to write, it just all comes out. So I think it's I've read a lot of resources, I've done my research, I'm thinking about this stuff kind of in the background of my psyche. And then I sit down and I might not write anything for 20 minutes, for an hour, and then all of a sudden it all pours out.
Right.
So there's a lot of it that is unconscious in a way.
Yeah.
But that when it actually pours out, it's flowing through a logical lens that I have through my own thinking capacity.
Right. Right. So as having all of this experience writing both essays and nonfiction and creative nonfiction and short stories and poetry and having taught English as well, how that's not the right question. Why is the right question? Why is it important to study all of these different types of writing and practice all of these different types of writing in order to, improve your own abilities to think and to write and communicate and all of that?
Okay, I'll do a little brief run through. So, I mean, poetry I mentioned already really hones your skill at getting exactly the right word and at creating a scene, an image that captures the mood that you're trying to create.
Right.
And the descriptive details, like the one or two descriptive details that kind of flash up into a mood, so that you can be you don't need that many words to create it, but just the right ones.
Right.
So it's the modifying words that are really important often, or the form of the verb that you use is really important. I mean, often one of the biggest things people can do to make their writing more interesting is to go through and look at every single verb and make it a more interesting verb,
Right.
a more exact, interesting verb, more descriptive verb. There's all the pro and anti adjective people out there.
I'm a pro adjective person so long as there aren't too many of them.
Well, there are many people that are anti-adjective in the writing world. That's passing a little bit, but that historically has been the case for probably a couple decades. Try to avoid the adjective, go more into the adverb, into using a more specific verb and noun. Anyway, poetry really hones those kind of micro skills, and also the conveying tone. To write good poetry, you have to effectively convey a tone, a mood.
Right.
Through your word choice, through your diction. So that's a good way to
and also through the pacing of how the words flow when you say them out loud. Right? Like something that is faster and has a lot like more shorter syllables is going to have a different mood than something that's effectively saying the same thing but has more longer drawn out syllables.
Yeah, that's one facet of diction. So, I mean, if you're trying to create a sense of speed or urgency, you'll use the more short cutoff.
Right.
And if you're really going into something pondering and deep and maybe even depressed, you can these really long sentences that barely ever get to the end. Anyway, poetry also for a lot of people helps them connect to themselves and connect to their own creativity. Because typically when people write poetry, they usually are not concerned about critical response.
Right.
Because as it is nowadays, people usually don't go around critiquing each other's poetry unless you're in an MFA program.
Right.
So, and then the nonfiction writing is really good for helping hone your thinking skills and your organizing skills. I mean, so if you want to communicate clearly, nonfiction writing is a good practice to learning how to do that. And, nowadays, of course, there are a lot of different ways to communicate in the world in a nonfiction way. I mean, a lot of people have moved towards kind of the PowerPoint approach, with the big headline and the little blurb and the big headline and the little blurb. But the essay structure is a really a finer mechanism for conveying a set of thoughts that's filled out and complete and satisfying to the reader.
Well, and something that I have noticed is that people often don't have the training in how to write that essay structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what is preventing them from doing whatever kind of writing it is that they're trying to do. Like, I know people who are trying to write emails to explain to potential readers what their book is about. And they don't know how to do that because they're not, that maybe their book is.
You're being recorded.
So I think knowing that essay structure and how to transition from one explanation of your idea to the next within that essay is really important. And you are excellent at that kind of transition. So can you give us a little bit of insight into how to improve our transitions?
Okay, well, as an English teacher, I can say that one of the most effective ways to learn how to bring the reader through a thought process is to spend some time working with coordinating conjunctions.
Okay.
So, do a Google search on coordinating conjunctions, and then, you'll find all these different ones, therefore, or because, since. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, and people overuse some of the most common ones. But the point is, what you say in the first half of the sentence and what you say in the second half of the sentence have to be related in the way that the conjunction says.
Right.
So if you say A because B, then B has to be the cause of A.
Right.
And, most people ignore that because they're used to using, because in the way it's used in the spoken word. But if you actually practice writing out sentences with coordinating conjunctions, this teaches you how to write more complex sentences.
Right.
Which is a skill most people never learned in school. And the whole point of these complex sentences is that they're showing this thought is related to this other thought in this way. And so it kind of draws the reader through the connection of the thoughts. So,
right.
So you as the writer are giving the connection of the thought structure to the reader, and then the reader finds it much more easier to follow.
Right.
So
instead of expecting your reader to just magically know what you mean by what you're saying, you're actually walking them through how your thinking is flowing in a logical way.
Yeah, but I would say even more, you're trying to say, this is how I see what reality is. Reality is A leads to B leads to C. And I'm gonna show you that exactly by using the right connecting words, the right coordinating conjunctions. And then, then there are thoughts, there's a kind of a stream of thoughts you can have where, you might be making a statement and then you have different thoughts or ideas that are related to it, and then you come to a point where you say there's this conclusion. And it's not always based on, okay, here's this example, here's this other example, but it's based on a line of thoughts that makes your thinking clear to the reader. So a lot of what writing good nonfiction is about knowing how to write for your audience, and not to write from your own internal thought process, but to write your thought process so that it's clear to a reader.
Right.
You have to have a kind of meta understanding of what you're doing. And that's where, you know, teaching really helps, because I mean, to teach well, you have to know how your students are thinking.
Mm.
And then you have to go from where they're at, whatever level their thinking is at, and then, you know, get them to +1, you know, get them to make it just a little bit more complex.
Right. So, so is this sort of process of first you have to understand what you're thinking, and then you have to understand how to say what you're thinking so that someone else can understand it when they read it. Is that is that why when I was learning how to write, I had to write through and do a full paper once to figure out what I was saying and then write a second paper to make it make sense?
That's pretty common. So usually, you know, when people are learning to write, the first draft is like, okay, let me figure out what I actually want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And the connections of the thoughts aren't always clear.
Right.
But then once you get everything out, you know, what you want to say, what examples you want to use, or what have you, then you can go back and look at the paragraph and say, okay, what am I really saying in this paragraph? What's the point I'm really making? And then you can strengthen your topic sentence and your concluding sentence to reflect that.
So would you recommend fixing a sentence here and there, or would you recommend completely rewriting the draft, almost starting over, but referring to your first draft as like notes?
That depends on, you know, what your first draft looks at and your process. I mean, in most cases, for example, when people are doing academic writing, you know, nobody wants to bother to rewrite a whole draft. I mean, come on. So, I mean, no, usually I wouldn't throw away the first draft, although, you know, there are times when you have to throw away bits and pieces or paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
But usually you can go back into the draft that someone's written or that you've written, and, you know, clarify what the paragraph is about, what belongs in the paragraph, what maybe should be split into another paragraph,
Mm-hmm.
and then tighten up your topic sentence so it really lets the reader know what this paragraph is going to be about. And then often, but not always, you know, something at the conclusion that is kind of not always repeating the point, but sometimes drawing another connection. Sometimes it's making a transition into the next thought for the next paragraph. And once you have those kind of brackets
Mm-hmm.
around your writing, then you can go in and make sure the transitions are smooth in the middle.
Right.
So that the thought process, I mean, sometimes you'll write something and you go back and you realize that you didn't really explain why this big example you talk about is relevant to your theme. And like,
Right.
you may know about it in your head, but, you know, your reader's not going to get it unless you really spell it out. So often, you know, writers that are learning, they don't know how to spell out all of their thinking process. There's stuff that they have in their head that they didn't put in the paper that then makes it hard for the reader to understand, well, why is that supporting your argument? Why is that, you know, connected?
Right.
So it's, you know, learning to be a little bit more explicit about how thoughts are connected and about what your thinking process is.
So what's a good way of learning how to make sure that you're not making those gaps? Because if I mean, if it's all in your head and you keep reading your paper over and over again, it's easy to not notice those gaps because you know in your head what the connection is, right?
Yeah. You know, and this is something I've honed through practice, so it's a little harder for me to talk about it. But, you know, you have to read through what you've written as if you know nothing about it and as if you're some reader from Podunk, wherever. And you're picking up this piece of reading and like, you have no idea what they're talking about, but, you know, you're willing, you're interested, you're willing to learn. And then sometimes if you read a piece that way, you can you can alert yourself to things that might not be in their vocabulary, things that might not, things that you know automatically what it is, but your reader might not.
Okay.
And I'll give a little the little thing that I learned from another teacher, which is when you're writing an essay, like an academic essay, the good mnemonic is that in every paragraph, you have to pee 3 times.
Okay.
P-E-E. Point. You make your point. You give your example, E, and you kind of explain your example and explain how your example is supporting your point. So point, example, explanation, or it could sometimes be point, explanation, example. But you got to pee 3 times in a good paragraph. And that's just really easy to remember. And that's something that's easy to practice. You got to make a point. What point are you trying to make? So, and that's usually a logical argument. It's not filled with a lot of facts or details. You're making a point. And then you get to your example. And then after you've given your example, you explain why your example is actually supporting your point. And this is where a lot of authors drop the ball, because they'll give an example and they'll just presume it's clear why the example is supporting their point. But in fact, the reader might not get it, because the author knows a lot more about the example than they were able to write about. And so sometimes it's drawing attention to a particular aspect of the example and using vocabulary that extends the whole discussion in your explanation statement really helps. It's like drawing the point to, this demonstrated political democracy, or, whatever it was. It's bringing things back to what
the fact that Donald Trump is running for president demonstrates the ridiculousness of the American political system.
Oh, that you're trying to do you're trying to do P all in one sentence.
Sorry.
The American political system is totally screwed up. Donald Trump is an excellent example of this. The fact that he can get up on TV and say all kinds of garbage and come across as, being some kind of legitimate whatever.
We're not politically biased at all.
shows clearly that the American political process is easily hijacked.
Okay, awesome. So
sometimes to write it well in a way that's easy readable, you do end up with more sentences than what you really wanted.
That's something I have to remember to do. I tend to write, when I'm going through first drafts, sometimes I'll write a sentence that's like 5 lines long. I'm like, wait, that's too long. That sentence is an entire paragraph of length. And then I have to go back and shorten it up, cut it up into bits.
A lot of people nowadays write run-on sentences. And that's also because people tend to write like they speak. But it's also because of a lack of practice in really being clear about where your thoughts are. Where does it begin and where does it end? And something more I wanted to say about that.
Does this go back to the bracketing comment you were making earlier?
Well, not exactly. It's a kind of laziness in thinking. I mean, it goes back. I mean, what I really wanted to mention was that it harkens to what's happening in society now, where we're in the digital bit world where people want sound bites. And, sound bites often are not even complete sentences. They're just little fragments of thoughts that are sent out there in a kind of disjointed way. And we're bombarded with these little sound bites constantly. And so people expect now that that's how we communicate through sound bites. But one of the results of that is that people are losing the ability to actually think clearly. That if you're getting all these sound bites coming at you constantly, you're just, you're always catching up with the sound bite, and like something sinks in and feels good or something doesn't. But people in general aren't being reflective and critical about it.
Mm-hmm.
The whole process of, like NPR has these online radio essays,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that is so rare, that somebody will actually extend a thought about a certain topic for more than 1 minute.
Right.
I mean, that's just very rare in modern society. And so people are losing the ability to think complexly about life.
Hmm.
And that shows up in the writing. So, I mean, it's true that on the one hand, there are a lot of situations where we want what we communicate to be straightforward and simple and easy to digest, to kind of fall in with the modern way of doing things. But on the other hand, we can be a little condescending is not the right word, but to our listeners or to our readers, if that's all we're giving them. If we don't give them the opportunity to have a more in-depth discussion of this or that. So for people to keep, to grow and maintain their ability to think critically about the world, they need to experience opportunities for that. They need to see other people doing that or read about other people doing that.
Well, and I actually think that a well-written essay, whether it's written for academia or for the average person as a blog post, if it's well written, if it's well structured, if it has clear transitions, then it's easy to understand and it's easy to follow, even though it is giving you that opportunity for complex thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because there's a difference between dumbing something down to oversimplify something and being clear in how you're thinking about something that's complex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's better and people appreciate it more when you talk about things that are complex and you make it clear.
Right.
I think that's more value because it's rarer, like you were saying.
Right. And it's something that, as a society, I think we need to be careful about what we're losing. We're gaining lots of things, but we also need to be careful about what we're losing and make a conscious choice about, do we want to lose that?
Right.
It's like, do we want to lose the ability to function well in face-to-face communication?
Yeah. Texting
is great and all that, but a lot of people have text-based relationships and not face-to-face, and they get into big trouble over it. Because they've lost the ability to do face-to-face.
Yeah.
Because, that's something that's not being taught. It's not being modeled. People aren't seeing it. So, you can't really blame the young people because, it's the world they're given in a way.
Yeah.
So it's the world we want to create, that we need to, consciously create what we know is valuable and worthwhile.
Right.
But I wanted to jump back to your original question, which was, why is writing in all these different forms important?
Yeah.
So most times as adults that we want to communicate, our audience is, other mature adults, right?
Right.
And, adults have busy lives. They do their work. They have other stuff. They're busy people in general. And, people don't have that much appetite for reading or listening to an essay. I mean, they have some, they'll do 1 or 2 a week maybe, but that's about it. So what really helps to engage the reader or the listener is to utilize your creative writing skills in your nonfiction writing.
Right.
I mean, it's like the typical thing of somebody gets up to give a speech and they try to put in some jokes. That's the what's the word?
The humor, the entertainment value.
Well, right. So but the thing is, a really good writer knows how to do it at the right time and
Right.
in the right way. So, I mean, it's become a cliche that the speaker gets up and says a few jokes and then does their boring speech.
Right.
But, you know, somebody that's skilled knows how to bring in those creative elements or the little stories, the anecdotes. I mean, it's the anecdotes that people will remember,
Right.
or the, you know, an unusual image that people might remember. So I was recently watching a video about PTSD and vets, and they were discussing difficulties in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And this one man, you know, who had trouble talking about relationships because that's not something, you know, men of his age usually do a lot.
Right.
You know, he's having trouble, and he was saying, you know, when you do this, like I get all stressed out, and then like I don't have my co-pilot. I don't have my co-pilot to, like, you know, check out what should I do, because when he was in the war, you know, he always had a co-pilot, and if they had to either fight or flee, they talked about it with each other and they made a decision together.
Right.
And so now he's having stress in his relationship, and it's like, where's my co-pilot? You know, I can't make a decision without my co-pilot. And that image, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
image is just so unusual and vivid. Like,
Yeah.
just a really strong feeling for what this man is experiencing. It's like, I'll remember that image for a long time because it's just such a wonderful picture of what his experience was.
Yeah.
So if you can capture the right image, I mean, people will tend to remember anecdotes and images.
Right.
So if you can, if you can come up with one metaphor that you keep harking back to that your whole topic relates to in some way,
Mm-hmm.
then it will be more memorable to your reader.
Right.
So that and then it's like it's a hook. It's something they can hook onto. So if you give them an image like this co-pilot image, all I have to do is think co-pilot, and the whole thing comes back to me.
Right.
You know, the whole experience of the whole process that I was learning about. And it's the same is true for your writing. If you hook some kind of image, or sometimes it could be one particularly good anecdote. I mean, it has to be a good anecdote, not a boring one, that has something, you know, new or exciting, different, just something unusual about it. And then you keep showing how all the unusual elements are connected to what you're saying.
Right.
Then that image becomes an access point for people to remember what you've actually said. And
Right.
then if it's easier for them to remember, then it's easier for them to use all the information that you gave them,
Right.
because it's going to be easy for them to remember. I mean, the main way people function with memory is one through emotion. So if you're able to bring up any emotion, that will work as well. But the other is
Right.
through images, through pictures.
Right.
But they have to be connected. They can't just be arbitrary.
Right. Like the images and the anecdotes and the scenes that you're using as metaphor need to be on theme. There needs to be congruency between the theme and the examples,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
unless you're giving a counterexample.
Right.
Right.
And hopefully the I don't know what to call it, the you know, you wouldn't pick a metaphor of a rose to talk about violent things. You'd pick a metaphor of a rose to talk about how things should be in a beautiful synchronous kind of way.
Right.
I mean, so there has to be a parallel. You can't arbitrarily pick your metaphors.
Right.
They have to
You
make sense.
don't, but they shouldn't, at the same time, they shouldn't necessarily be an expected metaphor, right?
Right.
So you wouldn't necessarily want to talk about a rose as a symbol of true love because everybody does that. You might want
Right.
to pick something else that means true love to you that might not mean true love to anybody else.
Right.
And so you're talking about using the practice that you get of accessing your creativity when you practice writing poetry and writing creative nonfiction and short stories and doing all of the free writing stuff, and getting practice in accessing those sorts of anecdotes and metaphors through the creative side,
Mm-hmm.
and then applying it within the nonfiction, essay, blog post type of writing to
Mm-hmm.
make what you're saying easier to remember and easier to understand.
And more interesting.
Yeah.
More engaging. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
I've learned a lot from you over the years, and you reminded me of all sorts of things that I had forgotten about. I didn't even realize I'd forgotten about. So, thank you.
You're very welcome, and best of luck in all of your writing adventures.
Thank you.